the Swiss Anabaptists, the German Anabaptists, the Dutch Anabaptists, and what we're going to do today on the English. Sort of jumps out to us because this, at least for most of us, is a trace of our own heritage. The English Baptists, who lead directly to the Baptists in America, which is responsible for the background of most of us. And so we put some attention on this, but we've got a lot to cover today, so let's take off with it. Roman numeral 1. It's the first thing, Henry VIII. First, Henry VIII is remembered as the king that breaks England away from the Roman Catholic Church. And of course, there's, as we looked at in world history with a few of you, there are considerable phases in Henry's life. He's fairly famous for the 6 wives that he had, 2 of whom he had put to death. The occasion of his divorce from his first wife and the refusal of the Roman Catholic Church to recognize it is what leads to his wanting to pull out of the Catholic Church. He'd previously been given an award by the Pope as a defender of the faith because he'd written a book designed to refute Martin Luther. But when his desire to have a son led him to want to divorce his first wife and marry a young Protestant woman with whom he was enamored and who would not be involved with him as one of his mistresses. When the Roman Catholic Church wouldn't recognize that divorce after a 6-year legal debate, he eventually just declared himself the head of the English Church and established the Church of England separate. You go through Henry VIII's life, and his attitude towards religion, you take through different phases depending on who his wife at the time is. I mean, you really can tie his attitude to each of his 6 wives. His last wife, by the way, is a Bible-believing Christian who leads him to Christ on his deathbed, which is a great story, but we spend time on that in world history class. But one thing doesn't change all the way through these 6 phases. He persecutes Baptists all the way through. So regardless of how things are changing for Lutherans and Catholics and Protestants, it doesn't change for Baptists. And so that's worth your noting. Through all the different phases of his attitude towards religion, he persecuted Baptists. A number of Baptists are burned at the stake. A number are imprisoned. Some flee to the forest. Others leave the country. In 1533, he issued a decree that everyone who believed in believers' baptism had 12 days to leave the country. 1533. He said that anybody that believed in believers' baptism had 12 days to leave the country. After that, they were eligible for execution. Instead of baptizing babies, baptism by immersion of believers only. Now, when the Church of England breaks from Catholicism, immediately there's 3 different elements in it. We're not going to spend a lot of time studying those elements. That's, again, world history class. But one of them is it wants to go back to Catholicism. One of them wants to have its own national state church that is a lot like Catholicism, but doesn't recognize the Pope. Then there's an evangelical element that's actually encouraging people to read the Bible and trust Christ and so forth. But even the evangelical element is opposed to the Baptists. For example, one famous evangelical leader, Hugh Latimer, said this: "The Anabaptists that were burnt in divers towns in England went to their death without any fear in the world, cheerfully. Well, let them go." And he said, they go to being burned at the stake so cheerfully and so bravely, just let them go. Remember his name, because he's going to come back up. Hugh Latimer. Well, 3 different times while Henry VIII is king, he issues something called an Act of Pardon. And in each case, this pardons all the prisoners in the prisons except those that are guilty of the worst crime. And each time the idea is the prisons are full, and so they're going to let everybody go except for the very worst criminals, murderers and homosexuals and Baptists. All 3 acts of pardon that released all the thieves and robbers and rapists did not release Baptists from prison. Okay? So really, in an outline form, B is that even the evangelical part of the Church of England persecuted the Baptists. C is the acts of pardon didn't cover Baptists, even though they covered lots of other things. Acts of pardon. And D is that there were many, many executions. Thousands of executions of Baptists during this time. One Englishman wrote to Erasmus and says that it's a wonder that they were not going through a firewood shortage because so many Baptists had been burned at the stake. That was probably funnier to him than it was to the Baptists. Roman numeral 2. Many Dutch Baptist missionaries came to England during this time. Many Dutch Baptist missionaries came to England during this time. You realize that how they were putting their life on the line when they did this. Many of these Dutch missionaries were killed, but they kept coming and kept playing an important part in starting Baptist churches throughout England. So we really forget how common this has been for believers throughout the ages. Dr. Dixon, who was here in chapel yesterday, has made a point. He has a national conference every year in October at his church. And he always tries to have a preacher from another country there to give folks an idea what it has been like for believers in that country. He's trying to get your dad there for next year, Alicia. But this last year had a fellow from Greece. The Orthodox Church has got everything sewed up legally so that it's illegal to have an independent church in Greece. And he had a Baptist pastor from Greece who operates there in defiance of the authorities and who's been fined and imprisoned. And you know anything about Greek prisons, you're famous for the beatings and all the horrible treatment and so forth while a person is there. And I happened to be there for 2 days during his conference this year and happened to hear the brother from Greece speak. And each year he tries to have somebody from a different country. 2 years ago he had somebody, maybe it's 3 years ago, whatever. One time recently he had somebody from South Africa talking about what the African National Congress was doing to the people preaching in independent churches there in South Africa. And we forget how common this is. This has been 200 years contrary to world history that we've had here in the United States. And I don't know how long we get to have it. But you see these Dutch Baptist preachers coming to England to start churches, knowing how likely it was that they'd give their life for a few months or a few years in order to get a church started. So next time it all seems too hard for you, think about that. Roman numeral 3. Edward VI, Henry's son, Edward VI put an end to religious persecution. He put an end to religious persecution in England for his lifetime. And I believe Edward was really a saved fella. The story goes that early, he became king when he was a teenager, that early during his time as king in the first few days, part of his job as king required him to go to an occasion where 2 Baptists were burned at the stake, one of them a woman. And he watched that and said, never again. And his advisor said, no, you've got to do that to keep the kingdom strong, and you won't be able to keep control of the government and whatever. But he refused to be a part of that. And so after he watched those first 2, he put an end to it. Unfortunately, because of his health, he only lasts as king for 6 years. But during the 6 years that Edward is the king, the religious persecution stops. And he is a king who spent a lot of time studying the Bible himself and a lot of time talking about spiritual things. And I think he was genuinely saved. I think he was 22. I think he became king when he was 16 and died when he was 22, something like that. But that takes us to Roman numeral 4, when his sister Mary becomes queen. And you can just head this way. She's remembered as Bloody Mary. She tried to reestablish the Catholic Church. And in doing so, she sent most of the evangelical leadership of the Church of England to be burned at the stake. Remember Hugh Latimer, the fellow who was so enthusiastic about Baptists getting burned at the stake? She sent him to his own stake burning. Most of the evangelical leaders in the Church of England she sent to be burned at the stake. As you can imagine, she wasn't a big fan of Baptists either. And so persecution of Baptists starts back up during this time as well. She only lives for 5 years as queen, and when she died, the country rejoiced. I mean, they rang the church bells in rejoicing at her death. She, by the way, had herself buried in a nun's outfit as a way of showing her loyalty to the church was Catholic Church. Well, Roman numeral 5 then is the next of Henry's children to become king, and that's Elizabeth, Queen Elizabeth I. And Elizabeth puts an end to all the persecution and recognizes the Church of England as a Protestant church. She puts an end to the persecution in the beginning here. She puts an end to the persecution, and she recognizes the Church of England as a Protestant church. So for several years, it's peaceful for believers again. Matter of fact, there are even some Baptist groups that send her letters of commendation and approval because she has been put an end to all this, and they feel comfortable with what she's doing. However, it's not to stay that way. Okay? Later on, she rules for a relatively long time. Later on in her rule, she declares something called the Act of Supremacy. The Act of Supremacy allows you to believe, any Christian doctrine you want to. You can't deny the duty of Christ in some things, but it gives you a wide range of doctrinal beliefs as long as you recognize the Queen as the head of the church. I mean, you can preach salvation by works or salvation by faith. You can, preach all sorts of different doctrines. You can baptize by immersion of believers only if you want to, or baptize babies, as long as you're willing to recognize the Queen as the head of the church. Now, out of all the groups in England, who do you figure had trouble with this? The Baptists. Because who's the head of the church? Christ. And if the Queen is the head of the church, the Bible's not the sole authority, is it? And if the Queen's the head of the church, you don't have separation of church and state. So what happens is virtually every other group is able to make peace with Queen Elizabeth and the Church of England, but not the Baptists. So again, you find Baptists being persecuted, and again you find Baptists being burned at the stake. And in her mind, I don't think it was religious as much as it was political. Yeah, not allowed that. She's behind it, yes. Well, Roman numeral 6. We got a couple of fairly famous incidents in early Baptist history we need to get to. So if it seems like I'm moving quickly, that's why. Roman numeral 6 are the Brownists. Just like the color, Brownists, only they're named after a fellow named Robert Brown. Brown begins to preach about the importance of churches being independent, self-governing congregations. They begin to preach the importance of independent churches. Now, some books will list him as a Baptist, some won't. I don't think he probably deserves to be called a Baptist, but the thing that he's most famous for happens to be a Baptist distinctive. And we've seen this over and over again. We're going to see it again yet. But what happens when somebody like Montanus or Robert Brown comes along and begins to preach about the importance of independent, self-governing churches? Some of them will become Baptists and some won't. Same thing happens with Brown. Even though he himself, I don't think, believed in believers' baptism, these independent churches that are coming out of his preaching, studying the Bible for themselves, some of them become Baptists. He is often called the father of the Congregationalist churches. Father of the Congregationalist. That's a name you almost never hear in the United States anymore, but if you go back into the 1800s, the Congregationalists were a pretty prominent movement. They were independent churches. They preached the gospel. Some of them believed all the Baptist distinctives. D.L. Moody, for example, was a Congregationalist. We remember how God used him in the great revival work and so forth.
So what Baptist distinctive was he known for?
The independent church. I'm sorry?
There's a lot of congregational churches.
Is there? Most of them aren't really congregational anymore. A long time ago, most of them merged with the Disciples of Christ. And I have come across an occasional real congregational church. It's one of those ironies. It's sort of like the Mormons talking about family values. How ridiculous with their heritage, Congregationalists merged in with the denomination. I mean, that's the exact opposite of what Robert Brown preached. Now, I have come across, I guess I've only come across one real independent Congregationalist church, and that was in Illinois, that went back and preached what the old-time Congregationalists did. Anyway, these folks have an influence of what's going on in England, their reaction against the state church. And again, the point that Brown is famous for is a Baptist distinctive, something he was right about. Roman numeral 7. And I'm trying to think how to make a long story short here. Just put right now put down the name Bishop Hooper. Bishop Hooper. Just Hooper like normal, H-O-O-P-E-R. Okay, here's the story. He begins to study the Scriptures, and he's in the Church of England, and he becomes convinced you ought to baptize by immersion and all these kind of things. And he begins to preach these things. And he's finally told, and you get the emphasis here, he's finally told that he must either preach the Bible as the final authority, not the sole authority, or he must leave the Church of England and be subject to persecution. You understand, this issue between the Bible as an authority and the Bible as the sole authority was for these folks a very big issue. If the Bible is the final authority or an authority, it still leaves room for the state's authority. But if it's the sole authority, and we're answerable only to the Scriptures in matters of faith and practice, that's a whole different ballgame. And this distinction was so important to the Church of England and to Queen Elizabeth that he is told to either quit preaching the sole authority of the Bible or leave the church and be subject to persecution like the Baptists. And the tragic ending of his story is he quits preaching that and goes back to preaching final authority, basically to save his life. But I say all that because I want to point out to you how critical the difference in all this is. Not just the followers of John Huss, but how critical the difference is all the way through in all this. Okay? That is why, and some people say final authority and they mean sole authority, and that's fine and all. But I will tell you, I have made a point as a pastor or anything else that I've done to make very clear that my position was on the sole authority of Scripture. Okay. Roman numeral 8. That's ironic that we would get to this today, but Roman numeral 8 is King James. And since we're only looking at him in light of his treatment of the Baptists right now, you'll get some other things in chapel, but right now we're looking at his relationship with the Baptists. And under King James, the executions cease. He does not execute people for their religious beliefs. However, they do keep being fined and imprisoned, but no execution. And it was pretty well known that if in a certain region the local officials quit bothering to fine people and they quit bothering to imprison them, that would not get them in trouble with the king. And he did not enforce this to any degree whatsoever, and people pretty clearly knew that he just as soon all this stuff went away. And so persecution declines dramatically under King James. Roman numeral 9 is a person who's almost never heard of. His name is Mark Busher. In 1614, he wrote a book about religious liberty. It's the first book ever written in England about religious freedom. He happens to be a Baptist preacher. He writes this book on religious freedom. I mean, you can't even get a copy of it today, so it wouldn't seem like it would be all that important to us. However, if you read the life of John Locke, John Locke is another fellow like King James and so many people that modern historians just lie about. They'll tell you that John Locke was a deist and he didn't believe the Bible and all that. It's all ridiculous. He wrote a book called The Reasonableness of Christianity, and it goes on to say things in there like, that so much of the Bible is easy to understand when you're willing to look at it. He said some things you just can't understand, but he said it doesn't matter because it's enough that God said them, whether you understand them or not. He speaks about his faith in Christ. John Locke was a Christian man. All this nonsense you hear about him being a deist is a lie. People tell that lie because it's very clear the founders of our country, Thomas Jefferson and those fellows, studied Locke, and they quote Locke all the time. John Locke's political ideas are exactly what's in our Declaration of Independence. Okay? But here's what's important. Even though Busher's book hadn't been in print for hundreds of years, it's obvious that John Locke studied it. In his own writings, he quotes Busher over and over and over again. Okay? So Busher's book has a real influence on John Locke outside of the Bible. John Locke is the man that is quoted the most by the founders of our country. Okay? A couple fellows went through, and they made a list of the fellows that signed the Declaration of Independence and signed the Constitution, or at the Constitutional Convention, and they went through all their writings, kept track of who they quoted. Far and away, they quote the Bible more than anything else. But then in second place, so much so that nobody else is close, is John Locke. Okay? So, I mean, John Locke really played a role in molding the thinking of the people that started the United States. But Mark Busher, a Baptist preacher, really played a role in molding the thinking of John Locke. And some of this comes full circle, because Thomas Jefferson said he got his ideas about balance of power and a threefold system of government and so forth from attending the business meetings of a Baptist church in his area. He went to their monthly business meetings. Didn't go to church. Wanted to save men. Can you imagine just going to business meetings in the Baptist church? But he went there and studied their church government because he thought it was so perfectly balanced. And he got the idea of advocating a president from watching a pastor. And the idea of a written constitution from seeing the use of the Bible. And the idea of people voting from watching folks vote in business meetings. I mean, don't ever underestimate the influence of Baptist doctrine and Baptist polity on the founding of the United States, even though most of the people who actually did the founding were not Baptists themselves. Okay? Roman numeral 10. This brings us to one of the most debated moments of Baptist history. It's called the Sea Baptist or Self-Baptist controversy. And this is what happens with it. A fella named John Smith, which is a fairly common English name, not the John Smith of Pocahontas story, different fella. John Smith, he was a Church of England preacher who left the Church of England and began to pastor a Congregationalist church. And while he's pastoring this Congregational church, he became convinced that baptism by immersion of believers was biblical. And he began to preach that. And his congregation accepted it. There's one little problem. None of them had ever been baptized by immersion. So, the question comes, what do you do? So Smith baptized himself. Now what I mean by that is he walked into the water and put himself all the way under the water and then came up and then began to baptize the members of his church by immersion. That's why it's called the self-Baptist issue. Well, some years later when he went to Holland and tried to join a Mennonite church, which required baptism before membership, they looked at his baptism and decided it wasn't legitimate because he baptized himself. And to this day, people still debate over whether or not his baptism was legitimate, and then, of course, whether or not the baptism of the members of his church was legitimate. There are folks who believe it was all legitimate, folks who believe that his baptism wasn't, but that the members that he baptized were, and folks that believe that none of their baptism was legitimate because since his wasn't, theirs couldn't have been. So, we'll take just a moment. Anybody with want to put a vote in on that, on how all that works? What we really get to here is the debate over, is the person that does the baptizing the part of the significance of whether it's real baptism or not? And some folks want somebody who was baptized by 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 John the Baptist. Yes, that's an interesting question. Of course, he didn't baptize himself. But I mean, the point was he didn't baptize himself. John the Baptist, as far as we know, was never baptized. In fact, he even says to Jesus, I need to be baptized of you.
So Jesus baptized?
No. That's what he said to Jesus, but that's not what Jesus did.
I think as long as the church recognizes the person, then they can do it.
Okay. His point was that so long as the church recognizes the person. Some folks get really nervous because there was and still is, I think, Pat Boone sort of started this. He would witness to some degree anyway to these Hollywood celebrities, and they'd make professions, and he'd baptize them in a swimming pool at his house and call them baptized. And most of us were quick to recognize that was not local church baptism. That's just somebody getting wet. Yes. The body of water, I don't think, is an issue to anybody. The issue is here, who does the baptizing? Right, and remember we saw with the Swiss Anabaptists, one baptized another one, and then that one baptized the rest of them, including the one that had baptized him. They're real fundamental Baptists who really want to make the emphasis so clear that, who has the authority to baptize, that this becomes an issue for them. I will tell you, in teaching Baptist history before, and at various times having pastors sit in the class, I've had folks with different opinions. And, of course, you could always throw out the what if, and it really doesn't hold up. What if you came across folks today who, in studying the Bible for themselves, would come to this conclusion, and you had a self-Baptist incident today? Would you accept them? That here in the United States is virtually irrelevant, because anybody that became convinced of baptism by immersion of believers only could find a church to baptize them. But we're not exactly looking at the same scenario for John Smith. And you could make the case that in other countries today, you might have places where there was not the same scenario. Their line of thinking was you would need to be baptized by somebody who had the authority, who was baptized by somebody who had the authority, and you said, yeah. I tell you my own scenario on this. I believe, in my mind, it's crystal clear. I don't have a fuss with the folks who disagree, that the authority to baptize is with a local church. And when this local church came to the understanding of the truth and wanted to be obedient to the truth, they then had the authority to handle that any way that they chose. And for example, it's not just a pastor. Our church Landmark, the pastor doesn't do much of the baptizing, does he? He is the pastor, and the church has designated that to somebody else. That's fairly common in large churches where it would be difficult for the pastor to get back and forth all the time, to have a staff member designated to do that. I'm convinced personally that it's given to the local church, and that he could do this not in his authority, but in the authority of that local church, of which he was a pastor. So I personally don't find myself having a problem with that, even though in his time some folks certainly did, and in our own time, as some folks look back at it, they do. There are some Baptist history books that are fairly common that will tell you this never really happened, but if you read your textbook on the subject, your textbook documents fully well that this did indeed happen. And there was a reason why people spent so much time debating this. Again, let me say, it's real easy to judge what folks did hundreds of years ago in different circumstances by what's available to us today. Okay? If a person today studying the Bible became convinced he should be baptized, it would not be hard to find a Baptist church that could baptize you. That's a different ballgame then. But what happens with this is there are some folks who believe that for a church to be legitimate, you have to be able to trace it back to a church that was legitimate. You have to trace that back to a church that was legitimate. And let me say to you, when a group of people commit themselves to the Word of God as a local church, at that point a church becomes legitimate, even if it started without connection. Okay? That is my understanding of it. And I think as you go through Baptist history, and when we get to the 1800s, you're going to see this over and over again. Okay? Where two or three are gathered together, okay, in obedience to the Scripture. So, okay. Anyway, that is one of the relatively famous incidents. Roman numeral 11. Two distinct groups of Baptists develop in England. And there'll eventually be a third, so we'll just throw that in at the same time. Two distinct group of Baptists develop in England. As these Baptist churches are developing, there's a doctrine that becomes a dividing thing between them. So the two groups become the General Baptist and the Particular Baptist. General Baptist and Particular Baptist. The General Baptists got their name from their belief that Christ died in general for everybody. That's the name from their belief that Christ died in general for everybody. The Particular Baptists got their name from the belief that Christ died for particular people, the elect. That Christ died for particular people, the elect. And that is, of course, the doctrine that's known as Calvinism. Now, right up front, it would seem easy for me to say, okay, then I'm a General Baptist. But it doesn't become that easy. The General Baptists put such an emphasis on the idea of salvation by faith, which is a fine Bible emphasis, but this is easy to do with a Bible doctrine. You stretch it out of its context. They have you getting saved by faith and staying saved by staying in faith. So as soon as if you quit having faith, you're not saved. Aren't you glad when John the Baptist had his moment of doubt there in Herod's prison, he didn't lose what he had? Man, I'm telling you, I'm glad the issue is not that I hold on, but that the Lord holds on. And so the general Baptists begin to be known not just for their belief that Christ died for everyone, but that continuing faith is the basis for salvation. In other words, they begin to believe you can lose your salvation. They become the same as the Arminians. And so pretty quickly, you have Baptists that aren't very comfortable being identified with either group. And so they begin to say, no, I'm not a general Baptist. I'm not a particular Baptist. I'm a regular Baptist. Man, doesn't this look like a great test question? 3 types of Baptists. A regular Baptist. Now, we could give you the long definition. A regular Baptist is somebody that believes Christ died for everyone, but that believers are secure. But I'll settle for simple definition. They believe the Bible on the subject. Then I'll let you guess which one of the 3 that I identify with. Honestly, that all sounds a little smart-aleck, but honestly, I do believe that these folks allowed themselves to be influenced by the writings of Jacob Arminius. And these folks allowed themselves to be influenced by the writings of John Calvin and those that followed these men. And John Calvin was a brilliant man. You can learn a lot from him. Jacob Arminius was a brilliant man. You can learn a lot from him. But there is a danger in putting too much emphasis on the writings of any man. Not that we shouldn't study all these people, and as these people point us to the Scriptures, learn from the Scriptures that they point us to. God uses people in that fashion. But you remember Dr. Dixon referred to it yesterday, the warning that's in 1 John says, you don't have a need that any man teach you. And the first reaction that might be, well, then what am I doing all this homework for and sitting in all these classes, and why am I up at 7:30 in the morning if we don't need anybody to teach us? The whole point of that Scripture is, whatever role anybody plays in putting information in front of you, whatever role anybody plays in calling your attention to the Scriptures, that person or persons is not to be your teacher. The Holy Spirit is. And you're supposed to study the truth. And your heart and mind is supposed to be bound by the Word of God. And I don't care if you have a chance to sit in front of the greatest teacher on the face of the earth, you let the Bible be your only authority, and not those teachers. If you ever have to pick between what you're taught at, God forbid, but if you ever have to pick between what you're taught at Landmark Baptist College and a Bible, you pick the Bible every time. Okay? If you ever have to pick between something I teach in a class and your clearest understanding of the Bible, you take the Bible. And then hopefully you'll understand it later on better and you'll agree with me. But in the meantime, you hang on. I mean, there's a real point to this, okay? I don't care who the teacher is and how good they are, how wise, or how many things they're right about. There's a danger in overemphasizing any human teacher, no matter how good they are. And so I really do feel like these folks got pulled aside some by the writings and influence of John Calvin. And these folks got pulled aside some by the writings and influence of Jacob Arminius. I think both those were saved men, Arminius and Calvin. And I think they both did a lot of good things, and God blessed them at times in their life because of the things that they were right about, but they're still human beings. And you know the sad thing, when you find people copying other people, rarely do they ever copy what they were right about. They copy what they were wrong about. And in this case, I believe that is what happened. Unfortunately, for a while, the majority of Baptists that we're going to read about in England fall into the general Baptist camp or into the particular Baptist camp. But years ago, when the Baptists first become the United States, you know, these designations were taken pretty seriously, and the regular Baptists flourished in the United States. And that is a name by which many Baptists went. Now, that whole group has almost faded into obscurity. There are very few of them today. My first job ever on a church staff happened to be at a regular Baptist church. And I found out a little bit more about them as a result of that and about their history, though, to be honest with you, the regular Baptists as a group, ironically enough today, not the church I was at, but most of them, ironically enough today, have been taken over by Calvinism. which is again a betrayal of the whole reason for having that name in the first place. And if you see a regular Baptist church today, you probably, not all of them, but most of them have services once a month. And they'll have one preacher that pastors 4 churches, and the first Sunday he'll go to this town, and then the next Sunday he'll go to this town. And so they go to church once a month whether they need it or not, you know. And as a movement, today it's pretty sick. There are a few exceptions. There's some groups of regular Baptists in Virginia and West Virginia and Indiana and Kentucky that are still Bible-believing, fundamental people trying to do a work for the Lord. But nationally, the name has fallen in some disrepute. But I don't want you to think that's what regular Baptists were always like. Okay? Because not by any stretch of the imagination was that to be the case. Okay? Roman numeral 12. This is called the Jacob Lathrop Church. And I particularly mention this because it's fairly well known, and in contrast to the Self-Baptist incident, the Jacob Lathrop Church, this is actually named after 2 of their preachers, which I think is a little dangerous thing. But anyway, the preacher named Henry Jacob, and then one named John Lathrop. It was a congregational church. And they are fairly prominent in England, but then most of them moved to the colonies. They're still congregational church. The ones remaining in England become convinced of believers' baptism. They're studying the Bible, working the Scriptures. They become convinced of believers' baptism. But nobody in the church has been baptized that way. Every one of them is sprinkled as a baby. Okay? So they take up a church offering and send their pastor to Holland to be baptized in a Baptist church in Holland, so that he can come back and baptize the rest of them, which is a different solution to the problem than in the Self-Baptist episode. And of course it is a solution that is not anywhere near marked by the same controversy. So anyway, their pastor goes to Holland and comes back and so forth. Later, a later pastor of this church is a fellow named William Kiffin, and he becomes he and his family become pretty significant leaders among English Baptists. It seems like every time you turn over a page in English Baptist history from this point on, you find a Pastor Kiffin. I mean, there's all kinds of them. I don't know how many of them there were and how many generations, but you find more Kiffins than you can keep track of from here on out. But he leads this church into becoming a very large church and a very strong church, and they begin to have a lot of influence among Baptists in England. And let me say this at this point. I do not think you have to have a large church to be a church that God's hand is upon, or you have to have a large church to be excited about your church. I do believe at times God raises up certain churches in order to use them to strengthen other churches. And then frankly, you end up having to have a degree of size and numbers and people and money and so forth to be able to be in that position. And so I do believe God raises up churches like that. And I think this is an example of that. We're going to see in Spurgeon's case another example of that. And one of the things that happens when you get to times, Canada is this way now, England is this way now, you get to times where there are not large, strong churches that are able to have an impact on the movement as a whole, and the movement suffers. In Canada, 200 is a large church. In England today, 100 for an independent Baptist church is a very large church. And because of that, you don't find churches able to help other churches by doing things like providing Bible colleges and mission programs and so forth. Yes. Travis.
As far as the general Baptist and regular Baptist, the GARBC that's now on the day, which are they?
Well, that's an interesting name because that's the General Association of Regular Baptist Churches. And I don't really think that name, the name General in their name doesn't have anything to do with this. The name General in their name implies the fact that it covers the whole country. And the word regular implies that they were taking this position, neither Arminian nor Calvinist. Now, the irony of that, if you were to look at the GRBC, the biggest debate going on in the GRBC today is over Calvinism. So again, the name, the origin of any group or whatever doesn't necessarily tell you what it's like 100 years later or 50 years later when they're still using that name. Because that was the reason they called themselves regular Baptist churches, to say that they had not gone either of these directions. You're dismissed.